Leon, Red Mercer built an empire from silence. Marvin clips. Doyle betrayed it for power. Eli Ward erased evidence until paranoia consumed him. Trent Holloway drove between borders until he crossed the wrong line. Rhett Conlon trained them like soldiers, but couldn't stop their collapse. In the early 2000s, Waltham Green sat quietly on the eastern edge of London, unnoticed and slowly decaying under the weight of neglect. Rows of brick houses lined the narrow streets, most of them worn down, their windows covered with thick curtains and their gardens left to rot. It was a place that had stopped dreaming. The factories had closed, youth clubs shut down, and anyone with ambition had long moved away. But for Leon, Red Mercer, Waltham Green was not a dead end. It was an opportunity. Red had just returned from a 6-year prison sentence for aggravated assault and armed robbery. He'd gone in as a street fighter with a bad temper, but he came out a strategist. Time behind bars had taught him patience and calculation. He had watched the inner workings of bigger gangs, learned who to trust, and most importantly, who to fear. Red had no intention of falling back into petty crime. He had bigger plans. At first, no one paid him much attention. He took a job at a scrapyard, kept his head down, and walked the streets as if he had changed. But quietly, he began assembling a team. He started with Eli Ward, a lanky teenager with a twitchy stare and a laptop he guarded like treasure. Eli had been expelled from school for hacking into the school's database and changing his grades. Red saw more than mischief in him. He saw a tool. Next came Trent Holloway, a smooth talker and street racer known for never losing a chase. Trent had a natural instinct behind the wheel and could disappear in London's winding backroads like smoke. Marvin, Clips. Doyle joined shortly after, a violent man with a long record from Glasgow who had somehow avoided any real jail time. He was unpredictable, brutal, and fearless, exactly what Red needed to send messages without words. The final piece was Rhett Conlon, an ex-military man dishonorably discharged for an undisclosed incident overseas. Rhett didn't talk much, but he had a presence that made people listen. He handled logistics, weapons, and training. With those 5 men, the Crimson Vultures were born. Their name came from Red's obsession with symbols. He believed vultures were misunderstood, cleaners of death, silent and methodical. He wanted his gang to be the same. No loud shows of power, no flashy street presence. Instead, they would work in silence, strike with precision, and vanish without a trace. In the beginning, their operations were small. They extorted shopkeepers for protection money, robbed drug dealers, and sold counterfeit electronics. But everything they did was careful and calculated. Red would plan every detail, from the escape routes to the time of day the job would hit. Mistakes weren't tolerated. If someone fell out of line, they disappeared. It wasn't long before the local gangs started noticing. The Vultures weren't loud, but their presence spread like a virus. They didn't challenge gangs head-on. Instead, they found their weak links: the drug runners, the debt collectors, the mistreated foot soldiers, and turned them. Red's rule was simple: find the cracks and force them open. By the end of their second year, the Vultures controlled most of Waltham Green's underworld. Police patrols increased, but arrests never stuck. Ali wiped evidence before it reached court, and any witness who dared speak out either changed their mind or vanished. Despite the growing power, Red remained unseen. He refused interviews, never flaunted his wealth, and stayed away from clubs and parties. He studied maps, analyzed routes, and watched his enemies. While others played the part of gangsters, Red was building an empire, and no one even realized it yet. What began as a 5-man crew in a forgotten corner of London was about to grow into something much darker, much bigger. The Crimson Vultures were ready to spread their wings. By 2008, the Crimson Vultures were no longer just a name whispered on street corners. They were a force creeping into cities far beyond Waltham Green. Their methods were slow, patient, and nearly invisible. Red Mercer didn't want media attention or flashy turf wars. He wanted control, and he wanted it silently. As he expanded his grip over East London, his eyes turned to the rest of the country. The gang's influence began spreading through strategic partnerships, intimidation, and surgical strikes. Red sent Marvin, Clips, Doyle to Birmingham under the guise of setting up a front business. Within 3 months, 3 key drug distributors in the city had been either arrested, disappeared, or mysteriously agreed to retire. No one connected the dots. On the surface, it looked like coincidence. In truth, Marvin's arrival had been the beginning of a quiet conquest. He didn't start wars. He ended them before they began. At the same time, Rhett Conlon established safe houses along motorways connecting major cities, including Bristol and Manchester. These weren't just hideouts. They were distribution hubs, armories, and surveillance centers. Rhett used his military experience to fortify each location, install escape routes, and train new members in tactical movement and silent communication. The Crimson Vultures weren't a street gang anymore. They were becoming a disciplined organization with a clear hierarchy and purpose. Eli Ward, now in his early 20s, had evolved into something far more dangerous than a teenage hacker. He created encrypted communication systems for the gang, used spyware to monitor rival gangs, and even hacked traffic systems during operations to slow police response times. He was the invisible shield behind the Vultures' success, making them almost impossible to pin down. Even when police tried surveillance, Eli would detect bugs and monitor the investigators themselves. But the real turning point came when Red Mercer decided to eliminate the Blackmore crew. The Blackmore crew had long dominated northern England. Brutal, heavily armed, and deeply connected with international suppliers, they were considered untouchable. For Red, that made them a threat and an opportunity. Instead of starting a turf war, he planned something far more sinister, dismantling the crew from the inside out. It began with whispers, rumors of disloyalty, secret meetings, and betrayal. Red planted fake messages between Blackmore members, convincing the leadership that certain lieutenants were plotting against them. Internal trust began to crumble. Then came the assassinations. Over the course of one weekend, 3 of Blackmore's highest-ranking members were found dead. One shot in his car outside a bar in Leeds, another strangled in a hotel room in Sheffield, and the third drowned in his own bathtub in Manchester. At each scene, a single Crimson Vulture feather was left behind. The killings sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The message was clear: the Crimson Vultures were everywhere, and no one was safe. The Blackmore crew disbanded in fear, their remnants absorbed or erased. Red hadn't just defeated a rival gang, he had buried a legend and replaced it with his own. With the Northern Territories under his shadow, Red moved quickly to secure ports and international connections. Trent Holloway, ever the reliable courier, began running routes between the UK and mainland Europe. His modified vehicles could carry thousands of pounds worth of narcotics without ever raising suspicion. He never got pulled over. He never got caught. By 2010, the Crimson Vultures had a presence in nearly every major UK city. They owned nightclubs, laundromats, garages, and storage units, all fronts for a criminal network running drugs, weapons, and money laundering operations. But what made them so dangerous wasn't just their reach. It was their silence. No one had seen Red Mercer in public for over a year. The leaders of the gang never used phones, and meetings were always in motion, inside moving vehicles or on boats drifting along canals. No fingerprints, no recordings, no witnesses. While police tried to understand who the Vultures were, the truth slipped further from their grasp. What began in Waltham Green had now infected an entire nation, and no one realized that the most ruthless gang in the UK was already standing in their shadow. By 2013, law enforcement agencies across the UK were struggling to keep up with the Crimson Vultures. Their name had grown into something larger than a gang. It had become a myth, A warning told in whispers throughout the criminal underworld. Rival groups avoided confrontation. Local gangs either fell in line or vanished. Police intelligence grew desperate, and pressure from higher-ups led to the formation of a new task force dedicated solely to dismantling the syndicate. It was named Operation Harrier, and at its head was Detective Inspector Nadia Keene. Keene had a reputation for being relentless. She was sharp, observant, and immune to intimidation. Her approach was methodical, mapping out gang territories, cross-referencing unsolved murders with known vulture activity, and building psychological profiles of the core members. But no matter how deep she dug, she always hit the same wall. There were no solid leads, no working informants, and no direct witnesses. The Crimson Vultures operated like shadows. They didn't leave fingerprints. They didn't talk. Frustrated by the silence, Keene began tracing back the earliest cases linked to the Vultures, focusing on financial trails, property ownership, and digital patterns. That's when something unusual emerged. Arrest records that had been altered, witness testimonies missing from files, and surveillance footage that had mysteriously been wiped clean. The inconsistencies weren't random. Someone was actively sabotaging the investigations. What she didn't know was that the Crimson Vultures had their own eyes inside the police force. Officer Jamie Wexler had joined the Metropolitan Police just 2 years earlier, and no one suspected him of anything. Young, polite, and ambitious, he fit the mold of a model officer. But Wexler had grown up in Waltham Green, just a few blocks from where Red Mercer first rose to power. Years ago, when Wexler's younger brother got tangled with local thugs, it was Red who had stepped in, brutally removing the threat and earning the loyalty of the Wexler family in return. Now, Jamie was repaying that debt. He worked quietly, feeding the Vultures classified intel, upcoming raids, license plate watch lists, tapped phone numbers, and police rotation schedules. With that information, the gang stayed ahead of the law at every turn. Drug shipments arrived safely. Safe houses were evacuated before surprise inspections. Suspected members managed to vanish just before arrests. For a long time, Operation Harrier made no progress, and Keene began to question if the gang really was as powerful as the rumors claimed, or if they were simply lucky. Then came a break, an accident, really. A minor drug bust led to a tip off about a rural property in Kent that didn't appear in any legal registry. Acting quickly, Keene led a small, quiet operation to the site. What they found changed everything. Inside the crumbling farmhouse were 4 sets of human remains, partially buried behind a false wall in the basement. Forensic analysis revealed that 2 of the bodies belonged to former confidential informants who had gone missing during past Vulture investigations. One was a mid-level gang member who had reportedly been cooperating. The 4th was a private investigator who had been hired by an anonymous source to track Vulture financial movements. The discovery was devastating and powerful. Keene finally had proof that the Vultures were not just organized, but lethal to anyone who crossed them. She also now believed what she had long suspected. Someone within the system was protecting the gang. The missing files, the altered records, it all pointed to a mole. She began a silent internal investigation, reviewing personnel logs and access histories. But Jamie Wexler was careful. He started leaving false trails, framing other officers, and even leaked partial evidence to distract the task force. Still, the pressure got to him. He drank more, showed signs of stress, and grew paranoid. At one funeral for a fallen officer, Wexler was seen speaking privately with a known associate of the Vultures. It was subtle, but it caught Keene's attention. She didn't confront him, yet. Instead, she watched and waited. What she didn't know was that the gang had already begun to suspect Wexler's loyalty as well. And when a crack forms in a group like the Crimson Vultures, the consequences are never clean. The silence that once protected the gang was starting to splinter. And for the first time, Red Mercer's empire was vulnerable. By 2017, the Crimson Vultures had reached the peak of their power. Their operations stretched from London to Liverpool, their drug shipments flowed through ports in the south and railways in the north, and their reach extended into Europe through secret deals with Eastern European suppliers. But with power came pressure, and inside the gang, old loyalty began to erode. The men who had once been bound by Red Mercer's vision were now pulling in different directions, driven by greed, fear, and ambition. Marvin Clips Doyle, once Red's most trusted enforcer, had grown restless. He believed he deserved more than what he was getting. While Red stayed behind the curtain, giving orders through intermediaries, Marvin was out on the streets, overseeing high-risk operations and eliminating threats. He saw himself as the true muscle of the organization, the man who built its reputation through blood. As more young recruits joined the Vultures, Marvin found that fewer of them even knew who Red Mercer was. That angered him. He wanted more than a cut. He wanted recognition and eventually, control. Eli Ward was spiraling. Years of pressure, paranoia, and exposure to the very drugs he helped distribute had changed him. Once the genius behind the Vultures' tech empire, Eli had become erratic and unreliable. He showed up late, ignored protocols, and sometimes disappeared for days. Red noticed. He began restricting Eli's access to critical systems, trusting him less with sensitive information. That only pushed Eli further into Marvin's orbit. Trent Holloway, the gang's loyal driver and smuggler, had started drifting. He had made connections in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Prague. And whispers in the Underworld suggested he was considering branching off, setting up his own route, and maybe even building his own crew. He didn't speak openly about it, but Red saw the signs. Trent no longer checked in after deliveries. He started stashing money in foreign accounts. Loyalty, Red realized, was a fading currency. Only Rhett Conlon remained steady. Still loyal, still quiet, still managing the logistics. But even he had questions. He had served in war zones, trained soldiers, and survived ambushes. Yet even he struggled to understand what the Vultures had become. The organization was no longer united. Fear had replaced loyalty. Silence had turned into secrets. And at the center of it all, Red Mercer, once the calculating mastermind, had become isolated, suspicious, and increasingly paranoid. Then came the betrayal. Marvin had made a secret deal with the Serbian cartel, offering them access to the Crimson Vultures' infrastructure, warehouses, smuggling routes, and insider knowledge, in exchange for money and protection. His plan was simple: take out Red, blame the police, and seize control of the gang with Li and a few loyal men. The setup was ruthless. On a rainy night near Brighton, Red's convoy was ambushed in a tunnel. Gunfire erupted, and 2 bodyguards were killed instantly. Red's SUV exploded in a massive fireball. The heat was so intense that the remains were impossible to identify. News of his death spread quickly, and the gang spiraled into chaos. Eli and Marvin vanished within hours, taking with them nearly $8 million in cash and encrypted records of operations. Rhett, shocked and disillusioned, went underground. Trent's body was found weeks later in Amsterdam, executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. No suspects were named. No motive was proven. The Crimson Vultures collapsed from within. Their territories were carved up by rival gangs and foreign syndicates. Their assets were raided, and their safe houses abandoned. Police celebrated, believing the country's most feared gang had finally fallen. But something didn't sit right with Detective Nadia Keene. No body had been recovered, no DNA confirmation, just a burned-out vehicle and a few scattered bones. And those who truly knew Red Mercer knew one thing: he didn't go down without a plan. The Crimson Vultures were dead in name, but in the shadows, something far more dangerous was about to awaken. In 2021, nearly 3 years after the fiery ambush that supposedly ended Red Mercer's life, whispers began to emerge across Europe. At first, they were dismissed. Just stories told by low-level criminals and drug runners desperate for attention. But the stories kept growing. They spoke of a burned man with a limp, a man who never showed his full face, who operated in silence and carried no phone, no paper trail. He was known only by a single name, the Birdman. Some claimed he was just a myth, a creation of fear among the fractured remnants of the Underworld. But others said they had seen him. Faceless under a hood, eyes sharp, commanding respect without saying a word. He never killed publicly, but wherever he passed, people disappeared. Deals were struck in abandoned factories. Weapons changed hands in empty train yards, and always, after he left, there was a single Crimson Vulture feather left behind. Detective Nadia Keene, now retired from active service but still consulted on high-profile cases, took notice. She had never accepted Red Mercer's death. The lack of a body, the speed of the ambush, the escape of Marvin and Eli, all of it had felt too clean, too controlled. When she heard of the Birdman, something clicked. The timing, the method, the fear, everything pointed back to one person. Marvin Doyle was the first confirmed death. His body was found in a shipping container at a port in Croatia, tied to a chair. His hands broken, his tongue cut out. Scrawled on the wall behind him in red spray paint were the words, "Fathers don't forget." No cameras caught who entered or left the port that night. No fingerprints, no leads. But Keene knew the message wasn't meant for the police. It was meant for Eli. Eli Ward, paranoid and addicted, had vanished after the ambush. He had been hiding in Eastern Europe under a false name, living in a high-security apartment in Warsaw. He thought he was safe, surrounded by encrypted firewalls and hired security. But safety was an illusion. His body was found weeks after Marvin's, frozen in a butcher's freezer, wires jammed into his jaw, eyes wide open in terror. A crimson feather was placed inside his mouth. These weren't random acts of vengeance. They were calculated, surgical. Someone was tying up loose ends, not out of rage, but with the cold precision of a man erasing betrayal. Keene went to Poland herself to investigate the scene. The Polish police dismissed it as a gang killing, but Keene saw deeper. The patterns, the silence, the symbolism, it was red. It had to be. Rhett Conlon, the last known original member, had gone off grid after the Vultures fell. He resurfaced briefly in northern Scotland under a different name, working in construction, living alone. He told no one about his past. But one morning, his truck was found abandoned on a mountain road. The engine still warm, but Rhett was gone. No signs of struggle. No note. Just a feather tied to the rearview mirror. Keene presented her findings to international law enforcement agencies, but they lacked hard evidence. Without fingerprints, surveillance footage, or live witnesses, no warrant could be issued. The case was filed away as circumstantial, and Keene was once again left to watch from the outside. To this day, no one has confirmed the Birdman's identity. No photos exist, no recordings. But his presence still lingers in the darkest corners of Europe's underworld. When shipments go missing, when crime lords vanish, when silence falls over entire networks, people say he's watching. Some believe Red Mercer faked his death, not just to escape betrayal, but to reinvent himself. No longer a gang leader, no longer tied to the name Crimson Vultures. Now, he's a myth, a warning, a man without mercy. And in the shadows of the criminal world, one truth remains: the Birdman flies alone, and he never leaves feathers behind without a reason.